Hello, welcome to this ThinkIn. I'm David, one of the editors at Tortoise, and as James Harding, our founder, said recently, I'm also a recovering Washington correspondent. So I'm absolutely delighted to say we're joined today by Dr. Fiona Hill, National Security Advisor to 3 American presidents, and one of the foremost DC experts on Putin and Russia, who also happens to be the daughter of a midwife and a coal miner from Bishop Auckland in County Durham. So Fiona, how are you? Great to see you.
I'm doing all right, thanks. It's really very nice to see lots of people. I've got it on the gallery view here so that I can see everyone joining. So hello to everyone.
Good. Well, there was a lot of love for Kate Bush in the chat, and I think it's going to be a really a fascinating session that's going to go everywhere, I hope. I was reminding myself that Fiona and I crossed over in DC. So I think we first met near a bookshop in DuPont Circle, about a mile north of the White House in 2013. And as I said, Fiona had served in the Bush and the Obama administrations, and she was at Brookings, one of the big think tanks. And she, I was there with the Times and, tapping into her knowledge on Putin and Russia. But I think that, I don't know who was the most surprised and delighted the first time we met each other and discovered we both had these remnants of these Northeast accents. And we'd both basically grown up, hadn't we, in the 80s in the Northeast of England.
Yeah, and I was amazed to find out that you'd worked for the Northern Echo, the local paper that, my family read every single day and still do. So that was a great connection, only in Washington or only somewhere else. I mean, it happens more often in other places too.
Exactly. And again, I mean, I think that it's right to say, that we sort of very quickly got into this this sort of, fierce agreement about the parallels we could see between the places we'd grown up in the 80s. The Northeast was pretty much industrial wasteland, wasn't it, at that time? And
it was. Yeah.
And you could see the same things in industrial towns in the US. And then the fascinating thing was, of course, you had this extra dimension that you'd been there in Russia, or the collapse of the Soviet Union, and saw what happened as Russia was getting going, and Putin saw an opportunity, right?
Exactly right. I mean, in the 1990s, basically after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the whole Russian economy fell apart. It was already falling apart, the Soviet economy, when I got there actually as a student in 1987-88. And I was really struck at that point, even though it was still the Soviet Union, the superpower, the other big empire. When I got there, it looked like Bishop Auckland on a large scale. And I was really shocked by that, because actually I'd never lived in a big city before. And, when I got to Moscow, this was the first big city I'd lived in, not the first big city I'd visited, but one that I'd lived in for an amount of time. And I was just so taken aback by, the lack of things in the shops. The fact that, of course, this was the socialist republic of workers and peasants, but everybody, was basically a blue collar worker, or their social mobility had come about through education, or come up through, the ranks of the Communist Party. But people had very similar perspectives to people from the Northeast of England. And many of the things that I saw there, even in Moscow itself, reminded me of home. I'd go out to the, the villages on the outskirts with friends from the institute I was studying at and think, oh, this looks like my granny and granddad's village, in County Durham. Really? And just even a few steps away, I mean, this is the Moscow of the 1980s and then later the 90s, not the Moscow of today, which is a glitzy, gleaming, mega modern city. You'd see these old wooden buildings with people having chickens in their yard, like my granddad had in his backyard.
And his pigeons,
or down on his allotment. Everyone had an allotment, and people would go out and do kind of vegetable picking at the weekends, and I'd do that at home and things as well. And we'd all have just the sort of the same interests, and the same interest even in music and things like this. The 1980s, I thought, wow, this was a strange transition. I was expecting it to be much more jarring and very different. So I was struck immediately by similarities rather than differences, notwithstanding all the politics, of course.
So here we are, I suppose, nearly a decade later after those conversations we were having, and Fiona's synthesized all of this into her book, which you can just make out over her left shoulder. It's called There Is Nothing For You Here. The County Durham edition presumably is called There Is Nothing For You Here, Pet.
Yes, exactly. In fact, I mean, it initially is what I was thinking of having in the title, but the editor thought I could drop that off. It might seem a bit strange. A term of endearment that we all know in the Northeast.
It comes from something your dad said to you, right?
Exactly. That's what my dad said to me in 1984 when I was, just about to go off to university, or apply for university. I think it was more like applying for it. And I'd been working in one of the local pubs, and my dad worked in the hospital at this point, just across the street from the pubs. And, the emergency room gave out onto the pubs because people were thinking so heavily that, when it was, last call, at the time when there was last call, there'd be one kind of just line going on from whatever fight had happened at the pub across the road to the hospital. And my dad would come and walk me home so that I wouldn't get in the middle of it all. And as we were kind of talking about, me applying to university or whatever we're going to do next. I mean, 1984 was a massive youth unemployment crisis in the UK. 90% of people like you and me, David, and maybe some people here, in the Zoom boxes might remember this, had nothing to go on to when they left school. I mean, 5 to 6% of UK students were going to university, but that was only 5 to 6% of everybody. I mean, from all kind of walks of life. And it was, only 10% of people having something, a job, an apprenticeship, maybe going off to university or, something else. And my dad was just basically saying, well, look, if you're going to go off to college, there's nothing for you here, pet. You won't be coming back again. You're going to have to go up and, go somewhere else. And he was, suggesting, London, maybe Europe, because I'd been learning German and French at school. I was thinking at this point of studying Russian, or the United States. And my dad had been very seriously considering emigrating to America in the 1960s when the coal mines all started to close down. I mean, it had gone one mine after another had closed. And they were still recruiting for miners in places like Australia, obviously in Canada, but also in the United States, in West Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and places like that. And my dad really seriously considered it, but my granny and granddad were basically dependent on him and he couldn't bring them with him. And so he changed his mind about that. But the irony would have been if he'd moved there in the 70s and 80s, and especially in the 80s and 90s, he would have lost his job there too.
Yeah, exactly right. The great skill of that title, "There's Nothing for You Here," is how it really not only speaks to your journey, I suppose, but it's also it's an intro to the kind of stunning changes we've all lived through. The rise to power of Trump and as we'll get on to, it's maybe a sort of silent commentary on your time in the administration, because I think that's there's no spoiler here. Fiona took a job in the Trump White House, and it was quite a surprise probably to a lot of your colleagues. I remember when I heard the news being extremely surprised, but I think you had a very clear idea of what it was you were doing, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, it was a surprise to me to get asked. Honestly, I mean, I never anticipated it, not in 1,000 years. And it came about in a way by chance, as often these things do. Obviously, I'd worked in, as you mentioned, like the Bush and the Obama administrations as the National Intelligence Officer. This is a non-political position. I was the chief analyst for the US government, pulling together all the sources of information, primarily about Russia and Eurasia. And putting those together for briefings like the long-range intelligence assessment, that everybody hears about, or briefings, the presidential daily brief, this kind of thing, and for cabinet members. And as a result of that, I'd met obviously an awful lot of people, particularly in the Bush administration, who were part of the Republican apparatus. And so in theory, Trump was a Republican, although in practice not at all. He kind of hijacked the party. But there were a lot of people who were going to go into the administration to staff it up, because he didn't really have many people in his campaign. Of course, his campaign, as we all know, was pretty flawed and had a real ragtag group of people there. And then there was also a woman, Katie McFarland, who was a Fox News host, who had been in several other Republican administrations and was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, the kind of bits like being a member of Chatham House or IISS. And when I was writing a book on Putin in 2013 and again in 2015, I did a second edition of it with a colleague. She'd invited me onto her show to talk about Putin and all the national security crises. She was a long, standing, national security expert and commentator. And she'd ended up on the campaign and had been named as the Deputy National Security Advisor. And I hadn't kind of put all of this together. And so she reached out along with some other people to ask me, about some advice about how to handle Putin, Russia, and all this aftermath and blow up over what had happened in 2016. And at first I thought I could do this from a distance, give you, your advice, but not have to take any responsibility for it. Basically, give people a kind of a sense of, what the, possibilities are of handling all of this. And then they said, well, would you come in? And I was so shocked. I actually bit my tongue, just kind of stop myself from making some shocked, alarmed kind of response. And I actually made my tongue bleed. It was sore for days because I was just, what? And then, I had a lot of deliberation, including, with you and, with other people. But I felt that, from a sense of public service and duty, I had to do it. Because I mean, it's like the house was on fire, and I felt like I really needed to respond, even though a lot of people said don't do it. Some of them said we'll never speak to you again, and a couple of them haven't. But you absolutely, others said you have to do this because if there's any kind of chance of turning things around. But the focus was really on national security and what do we do about Russia, and this kind of confrontational relationship we've got into, and what they've done, in terms of fueling discord inside of the United States.
So yes, it was your specialist subject. There was a sort of threat to democracy that was at large, and yet I know now from your book that on the day before you were approached, you were on the Women's March in DC, weren't you? So I mean, clearly,
I was, yeah, and I actually did tell my boss, my first boss, General McMaster, who thought it was kind of funny actually, because I said, look, I hated the misogyny and the racism and all the other things that were kind of infusing Trump's speech, all the sort of dog whistles to absolutely everything imaginable. And yeah, me and millions of people, including lots of dads and their daughters, I ran into all kinds of people who are out there just trying to get our voice, at least our presence felt.
Yeah.
And then the very next day I get a phone call. That's why I bit my tongue, asked me to kind of come in and, talk about this. But look, I mean, I really felt that the public service element overcame all of this and the national security risks of the United States. And, somebody had to step up there. And, it wasn't that I didn't put my trepidations to one side, I still had them. But I thought, well, look, I'll just go in there every day as a woman and as an immigrant as well. I mean, this anti-immigration, thrust was also really nasty. And I'll just try to do whatever I can. And honestly, if it becomes too much, then I'll step away. And I'll do what I can while I can, right? For the time that I have.
Interesting. And of course, it all ended beautifully, didn't it? So to give you an early clue,
strangely, kind of started with an impeachment trial. So
yes. Yeah. Well, let's just to give people an early clue about how it all panned out. I'm just going to share a line from what President Trump said last month when your book came out, and he said Fiona Hill was, and I quote, a deep state stiff with a nice accent. And I mean, my only question is, has your publisher got that on the dust jacket?
They have, in fact. I mean, up on one of the shelves just sitting here, they sent me basically a framed copy of this because it also starts off, Fiona Hill was terrible at her job. So it was a very belated job performance review, from somebody who paid no attention to me whatsoever while I was there. And it came just a couple of years too late, but, hey, sometimes you have to wait around for these things.
And he sort of, I mean, it was one of those great things where he said, I mean, all these people are writing these books about Trump, but they know absolutely nothing about me. And, I suppose the good news for him is that your book isn't really much about him at all. And I'm intrigued to know what you would say it is about, because it's about a lot.
It is. I mean, partly it's about how we ended up in the United States with Trump and how we got elected in 2016, which was not by Vladimir Putin. Even though, the Russians and particularly the Russian security services are only too happy to take credit for that, good old claps on the back, popping champagne corks and giving themselves medals. That's, too much of kind of letting everybody else off the hook, because Trump was really a kind of a product of American politics and, society and a whole number of changes since the 1980s. I mean, Trump's been in a way running for president forever. And ever since we all remember him as a sort of celebrity businessman making cameos in Home Alone 2, which is kind of the first time I remember actually seeing him, pop up back in the, the 1980s. But the book's, I mean, basically in part, it's about the journey of someone like me, as I say in the book, from the coal house to the White House. So it's about, kind of class, the Northeast, deindustrialization, the kind of loss of people's jobs and sense of well-being and identity, because I talk about my dad in the book, of being always a coal miner, even though, by the time he'd retired, he'd worked in the Bishop Auckland General Hospital as a porter for decades more than he'd ever worked down the mines. But those senses of communities in places like County Durham, which could be the same all over any kind of coal country in the UK, where people feel that kind of sense of identity and community built up around their place of work, and all of that getting lost. Then, seeing deindustrialization happen in the Soviet Union and Russia, and, the whole kind of progress there towards Vladimir Putin, who comes in also as a sort of a populist leader. I'm going to fix everything again after the 1990s and the kind of collapse of the Soviet Union. It's a book also about, all the barriers to opportunity, the things that stop people from getting ahead in the UK, the United States, and elsewhere. It's class, gender, accent, race. I see that, really in detail in the United States in ways I didn't in the UK growing up in the northeast of England. It's, kind of a book also about, the largest sweeps of history, US-Russian relations, Trump and Putin and how they're alike and how they're dissimilar. And then, because I work at the Brookings Institution, for some people, the most boring part of the book, it's also about public policy and about, kind of some of the ways in which we can fix things. And it's really focused there on education and, retraining and people getting skilled again for, new economy.
We'll try and rattle through all of that in the next already only 42 minutes, but I just want to I want to sort of start near the end if I can, Fiona, because not that many people had heard of Fiona Hill when the first impeachment hearings were starting, I should add, in November of 2019. And it was the 21st of November when you gave evidence. And just to sort of set the scene a little bit, you were, I know you were there as a fact witness. You weren't there as as someone who was partisan. And the background to it was, so to remind people, the second Trump impeachment hearing was about the storming of the Capitol at the beginning of this year. But this one was really about how we tried to strong arm Ukraine into interfering in the 2020 election, and to remind people, he was caught leaning on the Ukrainian president during a phone call, and he was basically making clear that that the furtherance of aid from America to Ukraine, which, lest we forget, occupied by Russia, was contingent upon them announcing an investigation into Joe Biden's son and his business dealings. And so it seemed a very clear attempt to solicit a foreign power to interfere in the election. And I think, again, just to give people a sense of it, you were at National Security thinking you were driving foreign policy towards Ukraine and Russia, and what became apparent was there was a shadow operation. There was Rudy Giuliani, Gordon Sondland, who was the US ambassador to the EU. They were basically running around doing errands in pursuit of the furtherance of Donald Trump. So as I say, not many people had heard of Fiona Hill, but afterwards, well, I mean, by about middle of the afternoon, you were kind of a feminist hero on social media, weren't you? So I think if we've got it, my colleague Connor might have just queued up a clip for us, and I'd love just to get a minute or two of that just to set the scene, and you'll see Fiona in room 1101, I believe, in the House of Representatives, going for it.
The same way, I think it's deeply unfair. Well, I think you might recall in my deposition on October 14th that I said that very unfortunately I had a bit of a blow-up with Ambassador Sondland, and I had a couple of testy encounters with him. One of those was in June 18, when I actually said to him, "Who put you in charge of Ukraine?" And I'll admit I was a bit rude, and that's when he told me the president, which shut me up. And this other meeting, it was about 15, 20 minutes, exactly as he depicted it was. I was actually, to be honest, angry with him. And, I hate to say it, but often when women show anger, it's not fully appreciated. It's often, pushed onto emotional issues, perhaps, or deflected onto other people. And what I was angry about was that he wasn't coordinating with us. Now, I actually realised, having listened to his deposition, that he was absolutely right, that he wasn't coordinating with us because we weren't doing the same thing that he was doing.
Dr. Hill, I want to verify this story. I understand that when you were 11 years old, there was a schoolboy who set your pigtails on fire, and you were taking a test. You turned around and with your hands snuffed out the fire and then proceeded to finish your test. Is that a true story?
It is a true story. I was a bit surprised to see that pop up today. It's one of the stories I occasionally tell because it had some very unfortunate consequences. Afterwards, my mother gave me a bowl haircut. So for the school photograph later in that week, I look like Richard III, or as if I'm going to be in a permanent...
Well, I think it underscores the fact that you speak truth, that you are steely, and I truly respect that.
I mean, your comic timing there is just magnificent. There were memes.
You can see from my expression that I'm remembering the haircut, because I was going, Mom, I got my hair alight. It's like pudding ball around my head.
It's so rough. So, and there were memes. I've seen you were called Queen Fiona.
Yeah, there was all sort of weird stuff. Yeah,
Fiona
cartoons. In fact, I've got some cartoons behind me from a really famous American cartoonist called Berkeley Breathitt. There was a comic strip called Bloom County. And there was a strip of these 3 cartoons that appeared later, me enforcing the return of overdue library books with an axe. I pull out my handbag or something. And then a friend contacted Berkeley Breathitt, and he sent them to me as a present.
That's amazing.
I mean, who would have thought that? I mean, I would never have imagined something like that in a million years. Yeah.
I saw one today of your head superimposed on that of Queen Elizabeth I as well.
Yeah, with the big ruff. Yeah.
You could rock that look, I think. But so what was it like to be? I mean, you were right in the eye of the storm, because this was peak tribal American politics, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Republicans carrying water for Trump, inadvertently probably passing the talking points of the Kremlin whilst doing it.
Yeah.
I think, I mean, not to make light of it, you were probably getting death threats and all of that. And I mean, you did, if you will allow me to say this, you did sort of slay on that day. You were, you not only spoke up, as people saw there, for women everywhere, but you really did the steely public servant, portrayal, just, I think, in a note perfect way. So I just wonder what the hell was it like to be in that crucible?
Well, I mean, the weird thing is that I didn't really fully process everything until afterwards, because it's just as you said. I mean, I was just, I went in there to do my job, to tell the truth. And coming from the northeast of England, I mean, we do have a reputation for being blunt and straightforward. And, a lot of politics is honestly farce. And so keeping a sense of humor is always a really good idea. And so, I've never really lost my sense of humor, because it helped me give perspective in some of the crazy, moments that I was there. And I was just focused on answering the questions. And also, I have to say that for myself, I was also trying to try to get to the bottom of everything too. Because I learned in that test, in real time with everybody else, what some of my purported colleagues had been up to. So, I mean, my job was supposed to be coordinating, not, kind of just sort of driving policy. And that's kind of one of those clips is me realizing in real time what Gordon Sondland was doing, because suddenly, as a result of all this inquiry, we had access to his WhatsApp messages, with another colleague, Kurt Volker, that nobody told us anything about. For example, there was emails back and forth where I realized, he'd put all these other people, on the list, and he was, supposed to be my counterpart, but clearly wasn't. I mean, he was a major bundler, donor of donations to Trump. And he had aspirations that he wasn't exactly hiding, to be Secretary of State on the next, sort of a round of a Trump presidency. And so he was clearly focused on the president and doing stuff for the president. And it became clear that although I'd thought, as I said in the past, that it was strange that the ambassador for the European Union was actually getting involved in all of these Ukrainian efforts. But by this time, our ambassador to the Ukraine, Masha Ivanovich, had been sacked because of all these machinations of Rudy Giuliani and these Ukrainian Americans and others who saw her in the way. Gordon Sondland sort of stepped in, and I assumed, naively, that this was, just freelancing on foreign policy and, working on national security. But all of this brought it into, the spotlight. It wasn't anything of the sort. This was, as I said, a domestic political errand, but it really was a private political errand for Trump.
It was Trump.
And we saw that in the, and I realized now that Trump was directing it.
Yeah. It really was the most vivid example of Trump first, not America first, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
We'll get to some of the outright sexism that you faced in the Trump White House, but it's sort of relevant to how you prepared for the hearing as well, because I think you you talk about the fact that have I got this right? There was one of Michelle Obama's former stylists who took you under their wing and said, okay, there's some things you're going to need to know.
Yeah, but you can tell that, I haven't had that advantage today. So I've gone back to my natural state, my natural plumage, and just the old kind of tired look here. But I mean, that to me was also indicative of so many things that I and many, women here, young and old, have all experienced about how, you're very much judged by your appearance, how you look before you even open your mouth and have anything to say. I already talked in that clip about anger as well, that, women showing anger is never seen as very becoming. And it certainly doesn't help you further your case. People are more likely to tune off rather than listen in attentively if you get angry and think you're emotional and try to deflect it and, don't accept it. Even if it's, well justified, might even be strategic anger, that kind of might be deployed effectively professionally. It's just, women are not able to really go there. But I was astounded that the very first thing, when I had the meeting with the legal team who were going to represent me in the testimony, was like, well, we've got to figure out what you're going to wear. And I was like, what? I mean, that's the first most important thing of preparation. And it turned out to be the case. And the PR person, Molly Levinson, who I write about in the book, said, first of all, well, the room is going to be really cold, so we're going to have to make sure that, you're dressed properly, because it's designed for all these congressmen who are, got suit jackets and everything else on, so they don't want to get hot and sweaty, but you're going to freeze because, women don't wear that many layers of clothing. I thought, oh, that's interesting information. So your teeth might chatter. So she makes me practice pressing the balls of my feet into the floor so that I'm not sitting there chattering teeth, because then people think I'm nervous and I've got something to hide. And I was like, gosh, and I hadn't thought about all of this stuff. And then it's, like I have to look as understated as possible and look like I, work in the government. I shouldn't be drawing attention this way or that way. It's like a camouflage. And so she selected the outfit. I mean, I had all of these things, but, kind of, I had to like lay out my entire wardrobe and put on the, the kind of FaceTime and go around. That was let me wear this dangly thing, around my neck, for example. And then she said, you're going to be in the style section of the Washington Post. That's the style section of the Washington Post. That's ridiculous. And we were. Me and David Hunter was sitting next to me. It looks a bit like James Bond. I mean, he was okay, So the Daniel Craig lookalike who I was sitting next to. But I thought this is preposterous. But it was getting this message across that to be heard and listened to, as a woman, you have to present yourself in a certain way, not appearing too threatening, not distracting in some way. And that's the only way that you can really get your voice heard. And of course, it was very important to emphasize that I was there as a witness, a fact witness. I wasn't there for any kind of demonstration of one thing or another, and that I was trying to present the truth.
Yes. And the line, should anyone want to be saved the errand of going to seek it out for themselves, from the style section, it said, their testimony was pointed, their clothes were reassuringly dull.
Reassuringly dull. But the emphasis on both of those bits.
So look, let's get back to the Trump White House in a minute, because I do want to go back to Bishop Auckland in the 1980s, and you with your Doc Martens and listening to the Clash and the Specials and all of that. What was it like there in the early 80s?
Well, my sister's just bought me for my birthday Dominic Sunbrook's very thick book on 1970, what is it, 1970 79 to 1982, who dared win? So I can read about what it was like, kind of from the outside in the 1980s. But what it felt like, was, I mean, when you're living your life and, it's all your friends around you and all in the same predicament, you sometimes you don't even know any better, but, from the larger, culture, from watching the TV, from listening to the radio, from reading all the papers that, things are not going well and you start to feel it. I mean, the reason I was sitting around listening to the Specials and the Clash and all kinds of, that almost revolutionary cultural outpouring was because we were all feeling frustrated and constrained and already feeling that lack of opportunity. In that period when I'd just gone to my, Bishop Barrington Comprehensive School, the school was a failing school. It had been the amalgamation of the secondary modern and the vocational school. It wasn't a former grammar school. We just moved to the comprehensive school system. I was one of the last group to take the 11 plus. And there was kind of nobody had any expectations of you. It was like, good luck if you make your way through school, and then good luck if you're going to have a job.
And I'm right in thinking on that you actually you passed the 11 plus and you had a chance to go to a really good school, but your family couldn't afford the bus fares, and so you went to the bog standard comp instead.
Yeah, I mean, even with the benefit of having the fees paid and some of the other subsidization of the education, and even if I'd got secondhand equipment, my mum and dad just didn't have any money. So basically, in that same period, for hospital porters and any ancillary workers in the NHS, I mean, people may recall looking back at that, there was just, complete wage disputes all the time because they were on the lowest pay rung in the ladder there. And in that period, in the kind of late 70s and early 80s, the NHS capped a lot of those wages. And in fact, they made proportionally less than they did before. So we were right there on the, the bread line. And then there was the bread strikes. So we were all in the bread line, as we discussed in the book. And it was just really hard to make ends meet. And so, just getting a pair of ripped jeans was even a miracle itself if you could find them in, the local thrift store. My mum had actually once made me a pair of jeans, which I wish she hadn't, because she was sick of hearing me complain about never having, any, jeans or any other, because we couldn't afford them. And the homemade jeans were, let's just say, homemade jeans.
So did you feel, I think I know the answer to this, that you were held back by not only accent, but where you grew up and what your dad did for a living?
When I was living in Bishop Auckland, no, because pretty much everybody else was in the same boat, and it was just great. My dad had a job because a lot of my friends' dads didn't have jobs. All their mums have jobs, and we're living in pretty dire circumstances. But it was once I moved out that I found what an obstacle it was. I describe in the book, I went on a County Durham school exchange to Tübingen in Baden-Württemberg in Germany. And it was an exchange for kids from all of the schools, kind of around County Durham, including private schools and some that were still fee-paying grammar schools. And in the kind of first sort of orientation session, a bunch of girls came up and asked me, who are you, what's your name, where are you from, what does your dad do, and what school do you go to? And it was immediately putting me in a box. And that's the first time I had this revelation about, whoa, hang on a second, there's a class system and I'm in it and I'm not in a very good place. And they would move on and not want to talk to me. And I was a little bit taken aback by this. And so at all these rungs of kind of moving out and getting these other opportunities, it's not just not being able to pick up the position at the place at the private school, but as you're kind of moving along, you realize that this is all holding you back. And there's a lot of discrimination still in the UK about people from the north. I mean, you can, hear your accent, David, in the media and comedy and entertainment. I've had a lot of people go on about, well, nobody's from the north's held back. Look at Ant and Dec. Well, Ant and Dec are comedians. I mean, they're really bloody funny. But, kind of, if you think about people at the top of politics or in business, it's not that usual to find a northern accent. And it doesn't mean to say that people aren't necessarily from the north. There's an awful lot of pressure to change the way you speak. And there's also, there are so many obstacles of place, not just of race and class and gender, but place to getting ahead, because so many places, that they don't have the tax base, really to invest in education. County Durham is unusual, actually, in that they always maintained their educational cultural budgets, even when times were really tough. And so, I did take a lot of benefit from school exchanges, extra money for like music classes and choirs and things like this and sports.
when you got to, from what I understand, it was, you know, you were kind of like volunteered to be the one who applied for Oxbridge, and when you went to Oxford for interview, you bumped back into one of those girls from the school.
From the Tübingen exchange. She was really shocked. I'd actually forgotten her name because she'd never spoken to me again. But for some reason, she'd remembered mine. And she said, Fiona Hill, what are you doing here? And it's like the scene from Billy Elliot, which was, you know, basically set in the same time during the miners' strike as well, also from County Durham. And he goes off to, you know, do his audition for the big ballet school, and they, you know, kind of make fun of him. And that's kind of how I felt as well. I mean, I was wearing, you know, something my mum had made, you know, kind of a heraldic skirt. I'm very grateful to my mum for making these clothes, but let's just say that, you know, they weren't always, you know, the best, most presentable. And a cardigan that my gran had bought me, and my gran was 80, you know, so it was kind of a nice cardigan. And I felt immediately just massively out of place, you know, very conscious again of what I was wearing, who I was, how I spoke. I was trying to be friendly to people, and, you know, I was getting this pushback. But I was very fortunate because after, you know, this bit of hazing from, you know, the people I met, including this girl from County Durham, the professor who was doing the interview, who, you know, very sadly in the blur of everything, I can't remember his name because I always wish I'd like to thank him, gave me almost like a kind of a life pep talk, told me that Oxford was not clean enough for me. He knew that I wanted to study Russian, which I wouldn't have been able to do there. And he advised me, you know, to go ahead and pursue St Andrews, and gave me all kinds of other friendly and kind tips too. So I was really grateful for that. Even though at this point Oxford was trying to expand the number of, you know, kids from, you know, kind of my kind of background there, he, you know, realized that maybe something else would have been better for me. And he was right. I mean, I wouldn't be here, you know, doing anything.
Again, just to sort of whiz through one of the sort of subsequent episodes, when it, correct me if I've got this wrong, but when you go to Russia for your time there, it coincided, didn't it, with the Reagan-Gorbachev meeting in Moscow, and you ended up as a kind of runner translator for one of the US networks, and it was like over the coffee machine, you met someone who said you should try for Harvard, and told you all the way through the process, and it all worked, and suddenly you were off and running, weren't you? And it was.
I think everybody can tell a story like that in their background or in their career path. These chance encounters with somebody who becomes, you know, kind of instrumental in the next step of your fate, really. But for someone, you know, coming from my kind of background, those encounters become even more consequential. And I think, you know, kind of in terms of, you know, your own personal drive, you realize, you know, when opportunities are cut off for everybody else around you, like my dad had just never had any opportunity. My mum had been a nurse and had the opportunity to train as a nurse, and actually loved it. But my sister, you know, many other friends didn't have the same, you know, sets of opportunities as I did, because of timing and, you know, some of the kind of funding getting cut off. And as soon as I saw an opportunity, I decided to take it. You know, it's like that Yogi Berra, the famous American baseball player, says, when you reach a fork in the road, take it. It's like it doesn't matter if it's left or right, just take it. Yeah. And when something like that came along, I thought, right, I should try this. You know, why not? It was a bit like the Oxford, you know, it was a disaster, but it propelled me onto, you know, kind of another path. It doesn't always work out.
And it's right to say, isn't it, that I think when you got to the States, you know, there you are at Harvard, and you go on and get your PhD and stuff, and find that world opening up to you. Accent no longer held you back. Being a woman certainly did, though, didn't it?
It did. And, you know, I was also, you know, very cognizant immediately that race was a big issue in the United States, and in Boston at Harvard. I saw it right away, something that I hadn't anticipated, you know, when I before I'd gotten there. But the you know, the ways that being a woman then were holding me back manifested in many dimensions that I didn't really at first expect. So I know this might kind of sound a bit strange, but, you know, in all the jobs that I'd had previously, and I did a lot before I ended up at Harvard, because, like, you know, lots of other people in the UK, and still as now as before, I had to, you know, work really hard. Even though I had a student grant, I thought to kind of do all kinds of jobs to, you know, keep my head above water. And I'd worked in a hospital cleaning, and the wage there was very transparent. Just as even as a temporary worker, I had the same salary as everybody else, and it didn't matter whether you're male or female. You know, everything was always very clear. And so I kind of assumed when I got to America, that particularly I've got a professional training, that would be the same. it took me a long time to realize that no, there was a lot of hidden bargaining going around behind the scenes, and also a lot of discrimination. And I discovered, in very unfortunate ways that, and there's a lot of research being done about this as well, that I was being paid $20,000 less than, a kind of a man in the same position. And this followed me all the way through my career. In fact, until I get really well up into my 40s and, early 50s. And, this is the same for many women. It was only in the United States in 2009 that there was an act of Congress named after Lily Ledbetter, a woman who was the only female manager in an Alabama tire factory, who discovered, like I did, accidentally, that she'd been, actually somebody told her, and that same happened to me many times too, that she had been grossly underpaid vis-a-vis the men. Even she had the same qualifications, she was doing exactly the same work, and it was about $20,000 as well. But by the time she discovered it, it was too late to do anything about it, because you were apparently supposed to file an unfair pay claim, but within, kind of, I don't know, a year to 18 months of finding this out, and hers is like 20 years down the line. And so, by this time it's accumulated these huge arrears, she can't do anything about it. But then this legislation, gets passed. And that makes a huge difference. I mean, if you think about it in the UK context, when the UK was in the EU, of course, there's a lot of equal opportunity, equal pay legislation that was passed, still in the UK, but the United States was very slow on the uptake of this. And there's these massive pay differentials that still exist within, the US, even in elite institutions like the Brookings Institution, Harvard, where I worked before, non-profits, where, women have been, grossly underpaid vis-a-vis men with the same qualifications and doing, exactly the same job. And also for race, kind of women who are, Black, who have, even worse situation of double disadvantage and double discrimination, for example.
Here's the most naive question of the evening. Did you encounter any sexism in the Trump White House?
Why, yes, I did, David. Part of that problem is, with Trump himself, the reason that I and others were marching around the White House just after his inauguration was that, clearly women don't count, quite the same as men in his orbit. But to be fair, nobody does. Because I also, found that not only was I disregarded as a, middle-aged, nondescript woman, by him right immediately. He didn't care that I was, his supposedly advisor on Russia, or any of the things that I'd done. It was all kind of meaningless. Anybody who went to work for him, no matter who they were also discounted. Because, Trump's view was that he was the only one who mattered. And he was the only person who really understood things. Everybody else, he literally said, was an idiot. And so in one of my early encounters, when Katie McFarland, who had brought me in on this idea that I would sort of sit down and have a blunt, straightforward talk to Trump about Putin, do the Putin talk with her and, some others, she tried to introduce me, to him properly, because I'd been in his presence before. He just never paid attention to me. He'd actually thought I was a secretary, this kind of thing. She sort of said, this is Fiona Hill, Dr. Fiona Hill. She's written this book on Putin's best book, I've ever read. And she's your new Russia advisor. And he just kind of looked like this. And he said, Rex is doing Russia. And he points towards Rex Tillerson, the Secretary of State, former CEO of ExxonMobil, who was sitting in the chair there. And I'd actually met Mr. Tillerson on many occasions in my professional, life. He kind of looked at me, we looked at each other, and I thought, all right then, Rex. But then even Rex himself found that it was extraordinarily hard to get any traction. That Trump didn't really listen to him either. He would have listened to him more had he still been the CEO of ExxonMobil. But once he started to work for him, then he was disregarded. But there were still hierarchies of being disregarded, and women, were definitely, unless they were very close to him, people who had been in his orbit through his private company, he really wouldn't pay very much attention at all. And, people like Gina Haspel, who then became the director of Central Intelligence, his briefer, a woman called Beth Summer, they had to work really hard at, penetrating that kind of membrane of, resistance to listening to anything from women.
Right. And the first time you went into the Oval Office is a sort of unforgettable scene. Your daughter had been sick and you were dashing to work. And what flowed from that?
Well, I forgot my shoes, like in my professional shoes. I was wearing sneakers because, I live about a mile from the metro, and I wasn't going to drive in because I was worried about parking and all the rest of it. It's my first day, and I thought I'd been in an orientation session. So I was literally sprinting down the street for a mile in my sneakers, and discovered that I'd left my shoes behind when I got there. And I thought, oh, it'll be all right. I'll be sitting in this orientation, getting my badge and, all these other things. And the next thing, somebody came in and said, oh, General McMaster, the National Security Advisor needs you to come over right away. You need to go into the Oval Office to help brief the president on the terrorist attack in the St. Petersburg metro. And I was like, the what? Because, my daughter had been ill all night. I hadn't listened to the news, another mistake. I rectified after that. And you've got to come over right now. And I was like, oh God, I don't have any shoes. And I've got to go into the Oval Office in sneakers. And immediately the guy says, oh, don't worry, there'll be somebody in General McMaster's office, one of the, the women there, will lend you a pair of shoes. But of course, my feet were far too big and I couldn't fit them in. So it was like Cinderella, but without the glass slipper on, like the ugly stepsisters with the glass slipper. And that was it. I just had to go into the Oval Office with the sneakers on. And General McMaster said, don't worry, just stick your feet under the chair. You'll be on the other side of the Resolute desk. He won't look up anywhere, which he was right. He didn't. And I did my kind of spiel for him because, I didn't know quite what to say, but I said, St. Petersburg Metro, it's Putin's hometown. It'll be very personal for him because he was going to make a condolence call. That's exactly what he said. This must be very personal for you, your hometown, terrible tragedy, Vladimir, that was that. I was like, phew, okay, now I can go back to the orientation session. And then Ivanka Trump comes in wearing this amazing flowing white lacy thing and impossibly high heels as she's going off to some kind of like gala performance. And she sits down right next to me and takes a quick look down and sees the sneakers because I hadn't stuck them far enough under the chair. And she just gives me that, side eye, that like, who the heck are you and what are you wearing? So I was immediately, but then I had to kind of like try to tiptoe out, trying not to have the sneakers seen, as we were leaving. But that also just set a whole tone. First of all, I thought, what the hell is Ivanka Trump doing in here?
Yeah.
And then I realized that she's actually, an advisor, and this is going to be a family affair. So this is not going to run like any kind of ordinary government.
So I'm really hogging this, and
I can see there's lots of things coming up in the chat here. Yeah.
I would like to bring in Patrick Davis if I could in a sec, because I don't know if you ever came across Patrick. Patrick was number 2 at the British Embassy in certainly the I think I'm right in saying Obama into Trump era, and so I think
I would definitely have met Patrick. Yeah,
got insights into that dilemma of what it is to serve and who you serve and whether you get a choice. Patrick,
yeah.
You put me on the spot, David. I'm in the middle of cooking dinner.
Excellent.
Oh, what are you having, Patrick? You're having something nice for dinner?
I'm making chicken jambalaya, Fiona.
Oh, nice.
So, and I had a bit of an accident with the loft ladder earlier. So, well, anyway. But,
it's all going your way.
It's all going really wrong.
Like it's this perfect preparation for an observation about the
it's like being caught in his sneakers, isn't it? Kind of in the Oval Office. It's like being caught making jambalaya at his kitchen stove.
It's fantastic to see you, and it's. I remember bringing my successor to see you in early 2018.
Right.
When it was the early. Well, no, it was a year into Trump, wasn't it?
A year in, yeah.
But I hesitate to say it was still relatively normal at that stage, but it wasn't normal at all. And I always remember thinking, I don't know how you do it, actually being inside, but I'm glad you did, because it's all too easy to say I would never work for this administration. But actually, there was a massive job to do to just try and keep some semblance of normality. And that, from sitting from the British Embassy perspective, it was really important to us in the UK that actually, the Trump presidency went as well as it could. Because, if it didn't, the implications for Britain, the rest of the West were terrible. And actually, we got a long way towards that. But I think it's thanks to you and many of your colleagues for just knuckling down and doing the best you could that actually, America is able to rebuild, basically, frankly.
Patrick, thank you. And Fiona, there's a strand of question in the chat as well where people are asking, did Trump just pursue his own preoccupations and whims, or did particular individuals have sway over him? And I think is right that you probably felt family came first, right? It counted double if they said, but usually they wouldn't challenge his worldview.
With a mixture of all of these things, I mean, I think, what Patrick also said is very important. I mean, there's 330 million people living in the United States. There's not one man. And, kind of the British system obviously is also dominated by the Prime Minister, but the Prime Minister is a product, whoever they are, of their particular party and, the kind of, larger system. In the United States, there's this weird way, really, of electing a president who then gets elected for the first time as the leader of their party. It's more of a sort of a popularity and a beauty contest. It's not as a result of party discipline. And I've been kind of like grappling, with this with other people and thinking about how could, that be done differently in a way to kind of prevent somebody from sort of hijacking not just the presidency, but also a political party. I mean, if you think about the UK, about Margaret Thatcher being removed by her party, you can't even contemplate that in the United States. I mean, technically in the US, once somebody leaves the presidency, they're no longer the leader of the party, but Trump has proven, for the first time that, you can still have enormous influence. And, what Patrick was saying about, kind of serving the country is very important there because, the United States, like the UK, is kind of an accumulation of all of these practices of governance over hundreds of years. There's a constitution. There are institutions, that rely on people, stepping up in the interests of public service and, basically for doing something there. And that becomes, kind of part of that sort of dilemma about, how you hold it together in the middle of all of this. Yeah. When you have somebody who is pursuing their own whims, because yes, to the question, he was, but he was also very easily swayed by others. So people who wanted to push their own policy agendas appearing on Fox News and then getting invited in for a phone call or into the Oval Office was a way of pushing their agenda. And a lot of people joined the administration because of their own pet issue. Yes. And, you saw an awful lot of people who, were trying to derive power from the presidency. They didn't see themselves really as part of the executive branch. Steve Bannon is one of the most obvious ones who had this, kind of revolutionary, insurgent idea of dismantling the state and describes himself as Lenin, kind of on many occasions, and, an anti-state, anti-establishment revolution. You had other people who wanted to,
pursue cargo pants. One of my
and I mean, people wanted to pursue, kind of Iran and the overturning of, the Iranian regime, or they had, issues that they wanted to, put their stamp on the judiciary. I mean, we saw that at Congress and, Capitol Hill overall, that the congressional Republicans wanted to make sure they had as many judges, including to the Supreme Court. There was an awful lot of people who wanted to harness themselves to Trump because he could be easily influenced. And he was also willing to push their agendas for his own power. So there wasn't a lot of coherence here to this.
If I could, because 6 minutes or so, 5 minutes to go.
Right, I'm going to look at my clock over here.
We need to do some Putin urgently. People really want to know from you, what does the West get wrong or misunderstand about his ambition and his agenda? We talked a little before we sort of came on about, how he's still sort of yanking Europe's chain on the gas pipeline. He's sort of changed his rhetoric recently on climate change. So I'm certainly interested to hear you tell us what you think he's up to in that field, but also the bigger picture. I know you've sat next to him at dinner. You were there in Helsinki when they did their press conference. So, what makes him tick? What does he want? How long is he here for? Tell us what you know.
Yeah, look, there's a number of different things that make Putin tick. He's, fairly complex, like everybody. Is not just a cartoon character. But, one of the primary things on his mind right now is staying in power, or at least certainly preserving his position and the position of the people around him in the system that he's created around him. Those amendments to the Constitution in 2020 that enable him to run for 2 more terms up till 2036, by which time he'll be 84. Recent commentary that was kind of kept on Russian television where he won't talk about succession or even whether he is going to run again in 2024 because he said it's destabilizing. I mean, basically, Putin is kind of presenting himself as the linchpin of the system. people around Putin say there's no Russia without Putin. He's kind of wedded himself to the state, so he's an expression of the state as well. So unlike Trump, who is all about himself, Putin is about himself, but he's also about the Russian state as sort of a intertwining factor. He runs Russia through the state. He believes in the state apparatus. He came in through the state. He describes himself as a servant of the state, a государственник in Russian. And, he wants to preserve this system. And every, kind of issue on the domestic and the foreign policy front is looked through that lens and that filter about preserving the system around him, because a lot of that is about preserving private assets and private positions, not just about, public positions and positions of authority. I mean, we know not just from Alexei Navalny, but the Pandora, papers and all kinds of investigative journalism, that the Russians stash a lot of money, not just in London, but, in all kinds of other places. That lawsuit against Catherine Belton that was, is basically being pushed through the British courts as all part of, pushing us all away from investigations of, where they're stashing all their various ill-gotten gains. So Putin is very focused right now on preservation, self-preservation, and group preservation. And how does he get that? Well, the world becomes a much sort of safer place for Vladimir Putin if there's not a lot of pushback, right? And we were pushing the United States in the past, along with the European Union and other, major players like the UK, good governance, transparency, anti-corruption, more democratic pluralism, more of a functioning electoral system. And when we're not doing that, fantastic. So the more corrupt we are, the more sleazy our politics becomes, the more we have someone like Trump, acting like a demagogue and, refuting not just democracy, but the whole electoral system. The more we have people out there for their own personal gain, be it political or, financial, the better, because Putin can kind of say, hey, we're not doing anything different from anyone else. All these guys are full of it when they try to push back against us. And you mentioned, very quickly, energy issues and climate. Putin knows that, the kind of current modus operandi of the Russian state is time limited. Mm. He knows that climate change is a fact. He can see it. I mean, there are larger fires in Russia this past year than all over the entire United States and cumulative across the rest of the globe. You've got massive methane emissions as the permafrost melts and making these mega sinkholes all over the place. You've got methane bubbling up in the Laptev Sea. You've got mass die-offs. I mean, you've got all kinds of things happening in Russia too. I was once in a crowd of very strange people in one of the margins of one of these Trump-Putin meetings, and you had Igor Sechin and Peskov, the press spokesman, and a whole host of others, and they're worrying about the environment. And Sechin says to the others, because they forget I'm there and that I speak Russian, he said, listen to us, we sound like a whole bunch of Greenpeace activists, and they'll go laugh, 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 ha, ha, ha. But they're actually genuinely worried. And so they know that the time is running out for basically having a model in which the entire economy is revolving around oil and gas and natural resources, because there is this drive. So they're trying to maximize what they can get out of the gas markets for now.
Right, Fiona. I while you were talking there, I had a small brainwave which I'm going to try and sell into my Tortoise colleagues, which is I think that we need to commission you to help us do a Putin podcast. And
did we get Putin?
Yeah, well, if you could get him, I mean, you were his dinner date once. I know that. You could. I think we could really do something fascinating on, whatever the angle is. I think, what does Putin want next? And I suppose just as a closing word, because we are hitting our time, just in a really short answer, I wonder if you could just tell me, do you think he's done permanent damage to American democracy? And I suppose that's a question
for Putin or Trump.
Well, yeah, I was going to say that's a question about Putin and about Trump.
Well, I worry about that, actually. I mean, I'm optimistic about the ability to self-repair. I mean, there's an awful lot of, private, and I don't mean sort of private sector, but, private sentiment and desire to change things here in the United States. I see that on all kinds of quarters at the local and state, and regional level. A lot of very concerned people in non-profits and, out there in the think tank and, world, and, kids of my daughter's generation who are 14 and more, all wanting to do something to change things. So there's an awful lot of a bubbling up of sentiment about trying to repair American democracy. But Trump has done a lot of damage, and I think some of it might be permanent in the style of governance and in stoking division. And that's where Vladimir Putin helped out, because he took advantage, he helped himself to those divisions and exploited them in 2016. And so, I came out of the government more worried about America and the state of American democracy than I was worried about Vladimir Putin, because if we manage to repair some of these problems, heal some of these divisions, is really why I want to write the book. And same in the UK, it would be much harder for Putin and others to exploit them. But the more, that we have kind of the corruption, the more we have, and I'm going to use a UK example, people like George Osborne deciding it's fine to work for an oligarch, Oleg Deripaska, whose, house in Washington, DC has just been raided by the FBI. The more doors that we open, for the Russians, so through corruption, through, private interest, and also through, the way that we conduct our politics, particularly online, in which, everything's become politicized, everything's become partisan, and people are just sort of stoking hate and division, because that's just sort of fuel and fodder, but not just for Trump, which is the way that he based his presidency, but also for Vladimir Putin or anybody else who wants to exploit it. But I do think that Trump has done some permanent damage in just the way that he's kind of shaped the discourse. It's going to be very hard to get out of that, because we see he hasn't gone away. He's still here. And he wants to seek the presidency again in 2024. So he says, on the back of a lie, that the 2020 election was stolen from him. And it seems to be very hard to get across to people, that a lie does not equate with free speech in the United States. It's a very different way of thinking than, obviously in the UK and elsewhere. And if he's running again on the back of this big lie that he actually won the 2020 election and gets, a majority of people to vote for him on that basis, I've said in other settings that democracy is done in the United States, because you can't base, your entire political system on the back of a lie.
It certainly feels fragile.
It's very
Fiona, this was as wide-ranging and fantastic as I hoped it would be. It's been really amazing to reconnect with you, and I'm serious about the Putin podcast idea.
Yeah, that'd be great. And we could bring in a number of other people, because one thing about Putin right now is Alexei Navalny. And you've got Ben Noble at King's College London, and a group of other young scholars have written this really fabulous book on Navalny, and what he really stands for in Russia is this generational alternative to Putin.
Yes,
so Putin isn't just standing there alone either. There's a lot of interesting aspects to that.
Well, it was a triumph and fantastic to see you, and I know that you've been in the New York Times bestseller list for the last 2 weeks.
That's a bit of a shocker, isn't it? Yeah, I hope this is beneficial for County Durham and Bishop Auckland as well.
Exactly. And I'm assured that, unlike Trump Jr., you didn't buy them all yourself. So
I did not. No, even my mum didn't.
Yeah, Fiona, fantastic. Great to see you, and I'm sure that people have got a lot from it tonight.
Yeah, thanks. It's really nice to see everybody's faces on here too, and I hope everyone has a nice dinner.
Very good. All right, we'll see you. Thanks so much.
Nice to see everyone. All the best. Bye bye.